Welcome to A Rare Reality, a podcast powered by Jordan's Guardian Angels. I'm Christina Janes, Director of Outreach and Awareness for JGA, and I am joined today by Kathy Lauterbaugh, who is a speech and language pathologist and owner of Creative Strategies Therapy in Boulder, Colorado. Kathy, thank you for spending some time with me today. I know that our families are going to be thrilled to hear all of the things that you have to say, and our very own Carol Backhouse just sings your praises. So,
well, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Tell me a little bit about some of the alternate therapies that you use, things that you have found to be helpful. Some of our families talk on a regular basis about how their children are nonverbal or moving into that verbal space or have just emerged into being verbal. And we want to be able to support them as best we can, support their children too. So what are some of the things that you use regularly to help?
Sure. When we're thinking about children who are not yet talking, or who may never talk in the way that many of us view communication to be, there's a lot of different things we can do. And I think probably a lot of the listeners of this podcast are familiar with the term AAC, and that's augmentative alternative communication. And that can look like a lot of different things. One of the most common ways to help children who are not talking communicate is sign language for younger children. It's a really easy, you can take it anywhere with you. Other forms of AAC, such as a specialized device or even just an iPad, you have to make sure that you have that with you. So there's pros and cons of a lot of different ways to help a nonverbal child communicate. And another thing that I'm often reminded of is nonverbal often does not mean nonverbal. Many of these children they actually do have a lot of verbal words. And sometimes it's just that they're still working on their clarity, or maybe they can only use one word at a time. And so AAC options help them add more details to their message. And I can list some of the things in addition to sign language that I use most frequently. So there's sign language, and then there's also something called PECS, which is the Picture Exchange Communication System. And it's where you teach a child to get a picture off of a board and hand it to you in order to request that object. And you can expand on that. You can do an entire picture book. And then there's also letter boards, which people might be familiar with if an adult has the stroke. They can blink yes, or blink twice for no. They can sometimes point at things. And there's a very large range of what is possible without actually talking with your voice. And I can expand on any of those topics as much as you would like me to.
Yeah, it's so interesting though, because some people think, oh my gosh, my child isn't speaking, my child isn't communicating. And what you're saying makes so much sense because they have so much that they are already giving to all of us. If we can listen and understand and then give them the feedback that they need to know that it's positive. Also, I think that what we hear sometimes is, I don't want to use sign language, or I don't want to use this because it can become a crutch. But research says the exact opposite of that. Correct?
Yes, that's very correct. And it is a myth that something like sign language will make your child not talk. I still get asked that question. Well, I don't want to use baby signs because then they're just going to sign and they're not going to talk. And that's not true. And what we actually know is that AAC options are just language, and they light up the brain in MRI scans the exact same way that talking does. Not from a motor pathway, of course. If you're using your hands and not your mouth, that's different. But the language centers of the brain light up the same. And so if you're looking at a young child who is not able to talk, if we give them a different way to communicate, we are helping their brain development. And if you don't give them a different way to communicate, then you're missing the opportunity to wire those neural pathways. And especially before the age of 3, 85% of neural connections are made in the brain. And it is so important that we give that child the chance to wire the communication piece of their brain.
Yes, so important. We always talk about this talk, read, sing element, the ability to be able to understand early on, and that the early light bulb, if you will, that they need in order to move forward as well. And with support, We know you're a firm believer that there are many ways to get the most out of your child with the support that they need. And so for a family who's listening right now, who's thinking, okay, and now we need to do something. We know that we have these first 3 years to really have something positive happen here. What's their first step? What should they be doing in order to make that first leap?
I think it depends on where they are in the journey. You're talking about someone who's just decided that maybe their child is not talking as much as they should be talking?
Right. And where to go next? What do you do? Should there be, what does that look like?
Sure. So there are a lot of different choices. Here in Colorado, there is Child Find Part C, where you can get a free evaluation from the state of Colorado. And that evaluation is done by a team of different disciplines. So you have a speech therapist, an occupational therapist, a psychologist. And you don't need a referral to get that evaluation. That's another misconception often, is people think they need their doctor's referral for that. And you do not. You just need to have the guardian request it. And sometimes that's a great place to start for a child who's under 3, because it's free and it will give you a general idea of the land, like the lay of the land of what you're looking at. Some families choose to get Child Find services called early intervention once they qualify through the Child Find process. Others choose to explore other options. Children's Hospital has an evaluation team, and then there's many private therapists in the area. I do always encourage people to start with the Child Find evaluation if they're at all interested, simply because it's free and this can really add up in cost.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, isn't that the truth? Yes. As a parent myself of a hard of hearing child, we leaned very heavily on our speech and language pathologist too, whom we just love. And she was such a great help to us in sort of guiding us along this path from early stages through to now. Jake does nothing but talk, but which is so wonderful and we love it. But I think it's so important to have that support system, because as you start to see that there are different stages of speech here and we're beginning to talk, then you've given them the tools to whatever that may be, whether it's sign language or using pictures, you're giving them the tools, you're encouraging that verbal output, but then once the child is starting to articulate, how do you best support them in that way at home, in the classroom? What's the best support system there?
So I think that's where you really need a really good team. And that means that, like you're talking about, you have a speech pathologist who you've known for a long time, who you really trust. And that person is in many ways part of your family, and you can ask them help for resources. And when you have a child who's starting to talk more or just communicate more, you really need consistency across different environments. And so that's where you need to hopefully put a team together of people who are willing to collaborate and who are interested in collaborating, and support that child in a similar way in different places. So hopefully at school, if your child is using an iPad to communicate, that iPad goes from school to home. And that can become a tricky topic if you talk to anyone who's, school wants to use their device and it doesn't really work for home. And there are often a lot of problems that are identified, and there's always a way to solve those problems and make it so that it's easy for the child to get their wants and needs met and to be able to comment on their environment. So you need the same strategies happening at school, happening in swimming class, happening at home.
Consistency is really key in all of this in order to have that success happen, and whatever that success outcome is from child to child, but having that consistent foundation across the board. Correct?
Correct.
Yeah. And I think that what, you pointed out, I was reading on your website too, you're talking about, there are strategies for each stage. There are strategies that parents can use, and also teach to teachers and teach to peers, correct? Is that something that can be done where you can involve the child's, their classmates, their t-ball team, whatever that may be?
Yes, definitely. And that's one of my favorite things to do, is to get other children to help and to make it feel like a group activity. So everyone is working on it. Everyone is learning about it at the same time. And especially if there are siblings, you can get the siblings involved in teaching the skills. And I think that you can also get the child to teach other people, depending on what you're working on. You can get the child themselves to teach their peers and their teachers how to do the strategies that help them or what they need to advocate for themselves in the classroom or in a peer environment. And I have had children sit in on their own IEP meetings as young as 5. And, I'm sure we could do it even younger if we really, if we really thought about it. And I've loved those situations where the schools have said, yes, this kindergartner can come to the IEP meeting. Let's see what they want to work on. And I think that's the most meaningful thing, is to try and get the child to decide.
And empowering them for their own advocacy too, in the long term and the short term, to be able to do that. I mean, what a gift.
Yes.
And I guess the way to put it would be that if you have children in a classroom with another child who's learning different skills, maybe in a different way, there's no way that that's going to impact the other children in a negative way, correct? From what I've seen in research is that it's a boon for everyone in that environment.
Yes. And I get asked that question a lot. And I think it comes from preschool aged children are very impressionable and they imitate each other. And as a parent, it can be really horrifying to see your 3-year-old come home and start doing some of the things that you don't want them to do. And the correct way to look at that, in my opinion, is that your child is a person in the world who is going to see many, many, many things in their life. And they have to learn to decide which pieces they want for themselves, and to learn that all humans are different, and to find those differences interesting and curious, and to celebrate them. I think that is a common catchphrase, to celebrate differences. But really, when we embrace that concept, life gets a lot more fun and it becomes a lot more meaningful to everyone. So I completely agree. It is not negative at all for the other children. It is actually just helping them be better citizens of the world who will all get along and have a happier life.
Oh, I love that. That makes me happy. We need good citizens in the world.
We do. Desperately.
Yes.
Desperately.
So let's switch gears a little bit here, because we talked just a bit about, you talk about the speech and language aspects of it. You touched a little bit on the motor planning part of it, where all of this everything has to sort of click together in its own way to come out. But there's an element of this too that also revolves around food. And I was reading some of what you do with the feeding therapies, and how important that could be. 'Cause some of our families say, we have a really hard time with X, Y, and Z in the feeding realm, which also ties into speech and language. So how are they intertwined?
So that's a great question. And it kind of makes me back up a little bit to where to start if your child is under 3. Another great reason to look at early intervention as a system is that you do get professionals who have experience looking at all areas of development, and they can be very, very helpful guides for, you're not just getting a speech pathologist who only knows about communication. You're getting someone who hopefully also knows about eating and sleeping and able to help you find resources in all of those areas. And some SLPs do feeding therapy as well, just like some occupational therapists do feeding therapy. Some psychologists do feeding therapy. There's overlap depending on the approach and what your specialty is in the world of feeding and eating. And so eating and speech can be related insofar as you can have a child who has oral motor coordination challenges across the board. And maybe you see that come up in their speech, and you see it come up in the way that they eat. However, it is really important to remember that eating and talking are different pathways in the brain. And it is very possible to have an eating challenge and a speech challenge or a language challenge that have nothing to do with each other. Or maybe there's a couple foundational skills that are impacting them, but they are different, and it's important to treat them differently. And the strategies you'd use to help someone chew are not going to be the same. You don't need that type of strength or that coordination to talk. It's a different type of motor plan. And then, where there are some similarities, though, I use the SOS approach to feeding as my template, which is the sequential oral sensory. And it was developed by a psychologist, Kay Toomey, and she is at the Star Center in South Denver. And what's wonderful about it is it really develops internal motivation to learn and to internal motivation to make choices about food. And the overlap there with communication is that a lot of the ways that I talk about food and learning about food, I use the same language when I talk to my kids about learning their sounds, or if we're working on grammar and sentences or vocabulary, whatever it might be. I use a lot of the same strategies, fill in the blanks or specific praise, like labeling what they're doing, as well as number scales to address anxiety, as well as the sensory piece that can impact eating, can sometimes also impact readiness to learn if you're looking at it from a whole sensory perspective.
Right. And touch on that sensory piece, because I know that that's a big part of this too, is that it can oftentimes create a stumbling block in some ways. It's hard to get through until you can get over the proverbial hump, if you will.
Right. So I don't want to oversimplify it, but sometimes I look at it as, if you were super itchy, you would not have any cognitive resources left to learn anything. And sometimes, I think that so that's one way to look at readiness to learn from a sensory perspective. Another way to look at readiness to learn from a sensory motor perspective is if your sensory motor system is not organized and ends up affecting your posture, like, you're slumping,
right,
for example, then now you have a situation where you're compressing your diaphragm and your rib cage, and now you're affecting speech. So those are some sensory motor examples, but from readiness to learn and readiness to talk. Then you also have children, when they're eating, sensory systems can impact picky eating. The example I give is pick a food that in your culture you've never had and is really atypical for us to eat in our culture. And this is somebody else's, I can't remember, somebody on the internet wrote an article about grasshoppers. Yeah. And it really resonated with me because I thought, oh yeah, grasshopper, that's not something I would ever eat. And as adults, we forget what it would be like to be presented with a grasshopper and told to eat it. You're not allowed to smell it. You can't take your time. You can't watch the other people eat it. You must eat it right away. And for our kids who have eating challenges, every food is the grasshopper. And so to have some compassion and really try and see it from where they're coming from is so essential for their therapy, because you have to match where they are at with their sensory needs. Is it terrifying visually? Is the smell really offensive? What do we need to get used to so that we can tolerate more foods and then become adventurous eaters? How do we get from scared to adventure, which is two very different ends.
Very different. I mean, you're ringing so many bells, things that we remember. Jake is now 4. And so we went through all of this with him. He would take a lot of food and pack it into the sides of his mouth because he just didn't know how to get rid of it. He didn't know that he really liked it. And we thought, okay, we have to change the way that we're looking at this with him. We have to sort of redo how we're giving him food, what we're introducing. So it's almost like retraining parents in a lot of ways.
Yes. And I work really hard to understand where the child is coming from. So the overstuffing, maybe they have lower proprioceptive awareness, understanding where their body is in space, which can affect understanding how much food is in your mouth. Or maybe they're a little bit lower tone and we need to work on strength and coordination to compensate for that. And then we, as the adults, whether it be a grandma or grandpa or a parent, we have to change how we're presenting the opportunity. And you can't force people to do anything. And kids are people. And so you can't force them to eat, to talk, to use the potty, but we can change the opportunities that we present. And if you're consistent, children, they reach for those opportunities.
Yeah. And it's a special light bulb moment to see too, when they do get it. And when they want to reach for those moments, it's so special for everybody involved, because it's like, oh, look, you did it. It's there. It happened.
Yes.
I think all of these things are so important and so, beneficial for our families to listen to. And also lots of families in the rare disease space who are looking and reaching and trying to find that moment where they think, okay, that's something that I can try. That's something that will be useful in our house on a regular basis. And, and looking at other things that you provide, you use the hippotherapy also. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I mean, animals are amazing. So if you can bring them into the learning experience, also talk about how that benefits. And for those who don't have any idea, what is hippotherapy?
So hippotherapy just means equine movement.
Mhm.
And it is a treatment strategy, just like I might do speech therapy with the use of a book or the use of a puzzle or the use of a therapy ball. I might do speech therapy with the use of equine movement. I
Mhm.
have even done feeding therapy with the use of equine movement, which required a lot of cleaning of things because there's a lot of
I'm
dust.
sure.
But
Yes.
it was really, really motivating for this child. So hippotherapy just means equine movement. And one very general principle is movement wires the brain.
Mhm.
And we learn through movement. Children learn through movement and they learn through play. And for many of the children that I work with, their movement is disorganized. And so if you put them on a horse, you can organize their movement. Children who are if you're in a wheelchair, for example, you might not be able to have volitional control over your movement, but you can still be moved passively. And that is a way to increase movement opportunities that will wire the brain. So that's one way to look at what equine movement can do.
Mhm.
Another way to look at it is the horse's movement affects the human pelvis as if it were walking. And your pelvic floor is the bottom of your core. So you have your pelvic floor and you have your transverse abdominals on the front and you have your multifidus on the back and you have your diaphragm in the middle and your vocal folds on the top. And that's your core. And so you can actually make changes to the whole system by affecting the pelvic floor. And I can affect jaw stability. I can affect rate of speech. I can affect attention, which is readiness for learning. And I can change positions. I can change the child's position on the horse, for example, sideways to get more coronal movement on the coronal plane, which can support different sensory reflexes depending on the position of the child. So I can change the horse's movement to do things with rate of speech or sensory input, but I can also change the child from a sensory reflex perspective, or even just thinking about what's going to make their hips more stable so that their jaw will be more stable so that their entire system is more ready for speech. And breath support. I've had a lot of children only be able to get 3 words out, and they get stronger and they figure out how to coordinate their core with their breath support system with their speech. And then we generalize that to off the horse. So it's a big topic, and there's a lot of different ways that you can look at equine movement and then just movement in general from a learning perspective. And I truly believe that we have to move in some capacity in order to learn. We cannot just sit these kids down and drill them. They need to move, and they need to start to figure out how to move themselves through learning opportunities. And then there's also horses and animals. You can also just do an equine assisted environment for example, social skills, because horses are very social. So now we're not looking at movement in the same regulating capacity from hippotherapy, but just learning from the horses. And I've done social skills groups where we use the horses. I've also had dogs at the farm be involved in the therapy, and that would just be an animal assisted environment, because animals are amazing, and they teach us a lot about ourselves.
Yeah, they bring out the best in people. That's for sure. I mean, I think it's incredible. I wish you could be cloned and sent everywhere. Because I think what you're right. Yeah. I think what you're doing is so interesting, and it's so beneficial to so many, because there's so many different ways of looking at it. Okay, well, if that doesn't work, then maybe there's this. If this doesn't work, then maybe there's that. But how important is that way to look at it too, where, okay, well, if this isn't working, let's look at something else that might be more beneficial. Who would have thought that a horse could help you learn to eat,
Yes, because you're now regulated.
Right.
And therefore your anxiety levels are lower, for example. That is the situation of the child where we did that. And there are many movement-based strategies out there. Music therapy is even movement. And there's many other different types of ways we can move children. What I do is specifically for speech therapy. But I do know that there's lots of other movement-based therapies that can help communication skills, even if it's not specifically within a speech therapy context.
It's incredible. I mean, I feel like I could keep you here all day, but I won't, because I know you have lots of people to help on these days. But for our families who are listening, not only our specific, Jordan's Guardian Angels family, both here in the US and around the world, but also other families who are listening today thinking, okay, gosh, like what should we be doing? And I know we touched on the actual steps and things that they should be looking into, but if they're feeling overwhelmed, do you have a message? Because we really try to uplift our families and make sure they feel like they're not alone and that there is help out there and there's things that they can do. So is there a message for those families, and things that they should know from an expert like you?
Yes, I think it is overwhelming, first of all, to navigate everything.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, you don't have to do it all at once. Like you really don't, and nor should you, because that's overwhelming for your child. And your child is going to do better if your family unit is okay.
Mm-hmm.
And so families where they just can't decide what they should do or in what order, they do some things and they take a break from those things and they try something new. And that will let you try all these different therapies. And the ones that are the most helpful for you and your child are the ones that you'll still be doing in 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
And some therapies are also best used for a short amount of time, and then you don't need to do them again. Other therapies are things that you can really come back to, and support the child in different ways. So I think viewing it as cycles, we're going to cycle through working on some of these things, and then
Mm-hmm.
being okay with, well, they're still working on their speech, but right now, I think my child really wants to learn to climb the stairs. So we're going to take a break from speech therapy and we're going to learn to climb the stairs, and,
Yes.
and that is okay. It's okay to take a break. You don't have to be constantly learning, and feeling overwhelmed with all of the pressures. It's a journey, and
Mm-hmm.
life for any human is full of cycles of different learning.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
I hope that is helpful. And I know that networks like Jordan's Angels and connecting families to other families are also a big part of being a little less overwhelmed,
Yes.
such that you have someone who has any idea what it's like to have to
Mm-hmm.
navigate all of this.
Mm-hmm. Let me tell you, when we have our families together for these family conferences, we bring everybody together. We're hoping that COVID willing, we can do it again next year, but to see them see each other and see the kids see each other and see the similarities, and the families can discuss, and our research team is there. It makes them know that they're not alone. And I hope for other families in the rare disease community and other families of special needs children, that you can find the same thing and create that team for yourself.
Yes.
Bringing everybody together. Kathy, thank you so much. I appreciate your time. I know that you are incredibly busy, so we appreciate you more than you know. We are going to put a link to your website here on the podcast as well, so everyone can, if you're in the Boulder area, they can see what you're up to, and also be able to link to you if they're not in the area to see what they can find in their area too. So thank you. Thank you. I appreciate you more than you know.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Yes. And if you want to catch the podcast, anybody out there, we are on Apple, Spotify, and Google Podcasts too, or you can go to our website, jordansguardianangels.org. The link there to the video version is ready for you as well. So thanks for listening. Kathy Lauterbaugh, thank you so much for spending some time with us. And we will see all of you again very soon.